It's going to start with Taggy laughing. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Scholar and Gentleman living rooms around the country, where we are gathered to read another book in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, In Memoriam for Chris Heron, Memory Eternal Brother. So this time we're reading book 7, Alyosha, which is a chapter that returns back to the plot, basically back into the complete melodrama and mayhem of crazy Russian life in this messed up family. And I have to say, I found this really refreshing. This chapter was this section was really fun to read. It's also, I don't know, kind of terrible to read because it, I think, has some of the book's portraits of humanity at its worst, but occasionally at its surprising best too. And I think there's some of the more humorous passages in the book again here. So fun read, but also serious at the same time, with Alyosha going through probably the biggest temptation and trial of his life, with the death of his elder and the odor of corruption. And like I said in our email, I think you start to see in the rest of the book the ideas that we've dealt with in the last few sections start to play out in real life in different characters. So I'm really looking forward to talking about this section with all you guys. We're going to start with the odor of corruption chapter. And I have to say, here we are back at the monastery for another brilliant scandal scene. I just love the the kind of really funny, also kind of troubling scandal scenes that we get at the monastery. It's like, put everyone in a place where they're supposed to behave well and watch things go wrong, you know? So I think there's some very funny lines in this chapter, especially if you've ever lived in or been exposed to the Orthodox church culture. And I just want to start on a lighthearted note of, you know, scenes from this chapter that you guys found particularly striking or enjoyable before we get into the serious stuff. We've been doing serious stuff for a couple weeks. Let's do some of the funny stuff.
I don't know. I think we've done funny stuff all the time.
Well, you do, Michael.
Yeah.
I read it as the order of corruption. I didn't realize it was odor for an embarrassingly long period of time. I thought it was like the Order of the Phoenix or something like that.
Isn't that how odors go, Aaron?
Mine do, yes.
Didn't realize for the longest time.
Makes me want to break out in song.
Dum, 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 dum. Maybe I am getting ahead of myself by going straight for the humor in this chapter. I don't know. We don't have to start there.
You know what's hilarious? Smelly dead bodies.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the whole chapter itself is like funny and sad, because the whole chapter is the idea that because a dead body starts to smell, suddenly he wasn't a religious guy anymore. And it's the whole like idea of it is really ridiculous.
And that leads me straight to my favorite quote in the whole chapter, which comes from just about my favorite character in the book, which is Madame Koklakov, who has Rakitin, you know, watching and sending reports on the half hour since she can't be in the monastery. And
he's basically running Twitter on this event.
Yeah, totally. And as soon as the report comes that they're smelling the odor of corruption, she writes this very angry note back saying, "I wouldn't have expected such conduct from him."
I don't know. It's like Dostoevsky trying to bring about like the insanity of like looking for miracles and stuff, and like That's kind of my read on this whole entire like section. And maybe I'm getting way too ahead here and jumping straight into the deep dive, but
Teddy takes it straight to the point.
it's like a satire almost, like on the frivolousness of external forms of mysticism and how that almost forms like a religion in itself within the Orthodox tradition, and how like, well, we can't have saints unless they're like fully incorrupt, because we have this like preponderance of saints that are incorrupt, but it doesn't mean it's like 100% at all. And so it's like just the insanity of looking for what is more or less somewhat random event within even the tradition, and then expecting it for like a person such as the elder Zosimas. Like it's kind of interesting.
From a not Orthodox perspective, I saw it more broadly as like, here was somebody saying what's the best in organized religion and the best in having faith, of like purely loving others, and then being contrasted with the worst thing, which is like everything has to have, like the structure and meet these qualifications and be about showiness, rather than about content.
It's also like, it's a confirmation, or it's like a confirmation of all of Ivan's kind of worst accusations of humanity. They need the miracles. They're incapable of like coping with gross bodies. Ivan says like Saint John, was it John the Merciful, is the one who kissed the sort of rotting sick person, and he's like, I can't understand how anyone could possibly do that. Sick people are gross. And this is sort of a portrayal, again, immediately after Zosima's kind of pain to how religion can raise you above yourself, to the idea that for a lot of people it doesn't raise them.
Well, and just to make a petty comparison, I felt like it reminded me so much of like a middle school or high school scene, right? Like it's just immediately these rumors start flying and there's these petty cliques. Yeah, totally. Like, oh, did you hear the elder stank? And like people gathering around and like dropping shade on each other. Like it was just, I felt like it was this moment of taking this organization that's supposed to be so noble, and you see how petty it could easily become. And that's partly, I feel like, when they get into why Alyosha is so hurt. And again, that's jumping way ahead, but we can come back to it. But he's saying like, it's not that I needed a miracle. It's like, I can't believe that this man I love so much is being treated like with such indignity, and everyone's just like, oh, and yeah, that's how it felt to me, and it hurt.
I think it's really funny that you brought up that it's like middle school, because I was just going to say it's like politics. And I think basically our points are the same. Because I was thinking when reading it that it really brings out like the politics of religion, where there already in the book was this whole like other kind of camp at the monastery of like anti-elders, over here. And I feel like they used that. Like immediately once this started happening, they used that to sort of gain this kind of political power in the monastery, and then to start spreading things and, discrediting their opponent, essentially.
Man, you guys are bringing out so many good points so fast. It's like we can't stay out of the good stuff. We get, got to dive into the thoughts. So I'll play too. I think another angle on it too is just how much delight, and this is just, sort of a psychological observation about how terrible humans are. Just how much delight there is in, watching the righteous man fall or whatever. There are all these people that are just so eager and delighted that this person, who everyone revered as holy, seems to have been confirmed by a sign from God not to be so, and that attitude carries on with Rakitin and his, kind of tormenting and temptation of Alyosha in the next chapter. But you just see over and over again kind of these numerous figures who are just taking delight in, see, he's not so holy. And of course, my favorite, also to bring this back to the funny, is when Father Farapont makes his big scene. Sort of bursts in. It's like you can imagine this crazed, like John the Baptist type locusts and honey, guy walking in, his hair all messed up and stuff, and starts running around like casting. I will cast out, and like just interrupts everything, and makes this gigantic scene. And one of my favorite lines in the chapter is when Father Farapont says, he denied devils. He gave purgatives against devils. So they've bred here like spiders in the corners. And on this day, he got himself stunk. In this, we see a great sign from God. Yeah, he got himself stunk. But even the holy, the faster and great ascetic guy, comes in and just absolutely kind of dances on his grave, almost literally,
Well, and that's where it's not called a laceration in this translation. What is that whole section called? It's strain. I feel like this is connecting back to some of that idea of strain, right? And it's not just in Rakitin. It's like Grushenka pours out her heart and says basically mostly what she's been trying to do is find a way to be able to delight in the downfall of some of these other men, right? Like that's what she wants to do. We could say that's what Snegirev was doing when he threw the money, right? Like it seems like that's one of the huge ideas in the whole book to me is for some reason we like to delight in someone else's downfall even more than we like to be happy ourselves, right? Like, and Grushenka, I think, really brings that to the fore, that she's like, maybe I have a moment to be happy, but I think I might rather get revenge. And I feel like that was exactly what happened with the money getting trampled on, right? And I feel like that's part of what's going on in the monastery is like, rather than celebrate the life of a great man, let's all like have a little petty party here.
I don't know. Like, I want to say, like, I want to tie this right back to the Onion, and we haven't gotten there yet. But like this whole idea of like, let's proffer forth like some sort of escape trajectory, as I mentioned like the last time, and like it's okay that we can just like dismiss that trajectory and we can not take hold of the Onion. We haven't gotten to the Onion yet, but I'm just going to introduce it right here about how we talk about like how it's just like Alyosha talks about it later on, like. I can't remember the full context, but that's how he like revives Grushenka by giving her an onion, and it's like a big and I'm sure we should discuss this a little bit further. I'm not prepared to do it, but the whole idea of like here we are trying to get outside of something where we're stuck, but we're rejoicing in where we are and not willing to take hold of that onion, and we're not willing to take hold of the trajectory outward, whether it's Snegiryov or whether it's Grushenka or whether it's some of the other ones, although we do see Grushenka later on do that. So maybe it's just like dancing, not so much on the grave of someone else, but more like rejoicing in where you are and giving some sort of credence to your own beliefs and where you want to be stuck at.
So these are the people, in other words, in hell that pull down the people that are trying to get out, because they're happy to pull down someone else who's escaping, basically.
Well, they're more likely to justify their own actions. This is their justification when they can pull down someone else, and it's like, well, see, I'm right, and it's like this elder of yours, like I was right all along. He wasn't as good as you thought he was, like, and I'm right by some sort of weird mental game where I can stay where I'm at. So
it's basically confirmation bias.
Yes.
Though I also think we could say, like, if we want to take that analogy, I don't, for me, in the analogy of the Onion story, the people dragging others back down to hell weren't the main villain in that story. The main villain is the woman who might have been able to help pull others out with her, but kicked them all off. And to me, that's what some of these monks are doing. Like, haha, my path might be more holy than his. So I don't care if, like, all this crowd gathered outside is heartbroken. I'm going to be the holy guy.
Let's reserve further conversation for the Onion until that chapter.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. But
Michael, rebellion.
I'm non-linear.
I definitely do see the connection, though. That's I think a keen observation.
Can we stick with Father Farapont for a second?
Absolutely.
I would love to.
Because I find him so weird. I'm like, I was trying to answer for myself, like, the way to, like, what is wrong with him, or what does Dostoevsky think is wrong with him? And in particular, like, does he think is he mentally ill? Is he just someone who doesn't actually believe and is kind of performing something that, you know, he's doing the kind of playing a role thing that so many other people are doing? He is specifically, he goes out of his way to point out that he doesn't read. And we know that in this book, like, people who read tend to be good and people who don't tend not to be. But I don't know.
I'm going to take issue with that last statement because just about literacy. I think if you remember Zosima's, this is such a minor trifle, but Zosima traveled around Holy Russia with his friend, I think it was Father Yosef, who was a humble, illiterate monk and had the great love for children. He was held up as an example. So just to offer one counterpoint to that. But I think your question is right on. Like, what is with this guy? Like, why is he a big figure? What might Dostoevsky think about it? I'm just going to think for a second out loud. So he's presented, or maybe to put it better, he's sort of tolerated by the community under the role of holy fool. You know, that's kind of where he's been categorized. So this is how the community sort of makes sense of him and or permits his type of behavior. I think there's a strong suggestion that this guy is mentally ill, although there's a tradition within Russian Orthodoxy in particular of how the mentally ill can be great saints or whatever. But I think that's what makes it interesting is when you have the holy fool playing out the role of sort of voicing the bad side of the community. Often the fool is the one who gets to say what the rest of the community won't, but is speaking the truth, you know? And so here he is kind of...
the foil.
It's like ironic that he's using his office of holy fool to speak more or less actual foolishness on behalf of the rest of the community. That is, you know, he's being the voice of evil here, which is, you know, the opposite of what someone in his role should be doing. But it also makes sense that he's the one that does it, you know? Mm-hmm. I think it's one of the great moments of tension in this whole section when you get this confrontation between Father Paisi and Father Farapont. It's like the showdown that's been building up, you know. And Paisi kind of has seen all this coming, even though he's standing in front of the casket reading the gospel. He's kind of hearing and putting the pieces together, what's going on. He's kind of waiting for it. And I actually think Paisi is a fascinating character in this chapter, incredibly three-dimensional. And I'd love to talk about him as well, if you guys will humor me. Because you know, this is his great moment. We'll talk to that, but just to backtrack a little bit of background on Paisi, why I think he's interesting. You see him as this guy who's trying to be, you know, sort of the better part of the tradition or whatever. He's trying to resist the communal momentum here to expect these great wonders that everyone's expecting to happen. And he even like kind of rebukes people a little bit gently for voicing these unreasonable expectations. But then he admits to himself, basically, I'm hoping for the same thing. And I see him as a very self-aware but self-aware character who's shares the same faults as others, but is actually aware of it, which is interesting. He sees the Obdorsk monk, the little kind of gossip guy running around everywhere, and he sees Rakitin out there, and he has this moment of sort of a flash of anger and judgment, like, why are these idiots here? And then right immediately after that is like, oh, I shouldn't think that way, Then he kind of offers some bland comfort to Alyosha. Later on, he's going to question Alyosha with some disbelief, like, do you doubt too? But then he's going to say, you'll come back though. And you've got this great confrontation and rebuke of Ferapont, where he seems to gather some resolve and have a moment of real character there, where he's the only one that's going to stand up and say, this is truth and you're speaking evil, So I'm curious what your guys' thoughts on Paichi were. I was surprised at how he kind of jumped into the center stage in such a complicated and layered, character.
I think I don't know. I'd like to jump back to Ferapont too, like before we get off of.
He immediately changes the subject.
That's my role. I think like Ferapont is kind of shown to be maybe
literarily.
Yes, that might be the word I'm trying to fabricate on the spot. He's trying to be like a foil in this, but he's trying to like McGee said, trying to put forth the issues that they have with the elder from an asinine point of view. But I almost wonder if he's trying to take this whole idea of holy fool and kind of twist it and say he's just a fool at the same time with a holy twist. He's twisted in a holy direction perhaps, but he's just actually just a fool. He really is just a fool. And that by resonating with the views of all the pilgrims there exposes their foolishness as well, in terms of they're the same type. They're fools, but they have a holy twist as well. They're kind of aligned towards that. They kind of experience their foolishness within a holy context, perhaps.
I would rephrase that as a twisted holiness.
Did I got kicked off a while? Did anybody mention that he's like a televangelist or like a modern evangelical leader?
That's kind of where I'm going at.
I mean, because it's about
thanks
fueling.
for putting that into a really specific context.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what I was thinking. It sounds like what you're saying. It's it's about him being self-indulgent and egotistical and arrogant, and look at me. Here's my show. That's how I described growing up in a mega church. Look at me. Here's my show. And that's what he's doing.
Father Ferapont really isn't all that holy in this, and you kind of see it. It's in this complete disregard. You see Father Ferapont, and if you want to twist it right back and say well, what's the difference between Zosimas and Ferapont? Ferapont lives on its own, not really doing anything, and he's just crazy, and people see him as holy because he's crazy. But that holiness and that craziness is not united within love, which you saw with Father Zosimas, and so it becomes this externalized form of asceticism that creates holiness versus a holiness that creates asceticism. And I think you see that this disparate view with Zosimas versus Ferapont, and it's how Zosimas died and how his view is in his last moment is that of repentance, and Zosimas is coming in and basically casting out demons in some sort of crazy way, like, and it's not like, it's like Orthodox funeral service is not that something that is supposed to be like, oh, he died for a reason, like it's that, but it's like it's actually a universally repentant experience. Like, we pray for the soul of the dead, but then we also remember within ourselves our own sinfulness and our need for repentance, and that's actually the majority of the Orthodox funeral service. So it's kind of interesting that dynamic is not at all present within any of this type of encounter here. Like, I know this is only a wake and it's not actually the funeral service, but still there should be that understanding, at least in my view.
Well, I can't help but thinking like this is coming right after the Grand Inquisitor, right? Or not long after we've encountered the Grand Inquisitor and then Zosima. And I'm not saying that Dostoevsky is saying that Farapont is the Grand Inquisitor. I don't think it's that neat of an analogy, but I think he is showing us how quickly the crowds at the monastery go seeking after the miracle, the next thing, right? Like, oh, Zosima smells, so therefore he can't be as holy as we thought. We need a miracle. And there's that weird scene where they're like, he's the holy one, right? And like people start like falling down at Farapont's feet, which is really creepy. Like that scene is really perturbing right after reading the Grand Inquisitor, when you see like how quickly people will turn on an actually holy, kind, gentle man and just turn to anything that seems more certain. Like, so I feel like that's at least part of the point. Again, I don't think it's a neat analogy as like Farapont, evil, bad, Grand Inquisitor, Satan, and Zosima, good, but I think it's showing some of these complications and tensions, that there really is some element in these religious communities that we have to be careful of, and that Father Paisley, as you were saying, is sort of checking in himself of like, I shouldn't rush to judgment. I shouldn't try and figure this out too quickly. I should be able to sit with some of this and not just be like, oh, a body is smelling the way that it often does, and many holy men's bodies have smelled too. Like, maybe I shouldn't be like immediately interpreting this as a sign of what my faith should be about.
But he forestalled nature
by smelling too fast.
I love that phrase. He forestalled nature.
Well, I mean, going completely along with what Melissa and Michael were just saying, Aaron, I really love that you brought up the idea of televangelist, because I think that really kind of nails it, because it's coming from this holy place, but it's also coming from this place of performance, and it's also coming from this place of wanting to like kind of drum up and excite, get more followers. And it kind of turns the whole crowd into almost this mob mentality. Whereas Father Paisley, in contrast, it kind of cracks me up, because most of the chapter, he's still reading the gospel. Oh, he's still reading the gospel, and all this shit is going on all around him. And he's trying to stay calm. And then when he does get into a confrontation, he's coming at it from, from a calmer, I don't know if calm's not quite the right word that I want, but from, I don't know, a more rational place, a more quiet place, a place of, we shouldn't just discredit everything. I still believe in Zosima, please don't ruin this funeral anymore. But that's not the type of thing that like excites people and feeds into their mob mentality, because he's kind of being too, I don't know, rational about it or something.
Well, let's take this right back to like the crucifixion of Christ, like, which I'm sure we're pretty much mostly familiar of. I mean, it's like, what? What?
Always going straight for the jugular, man.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
here we have like, Christ hanging on the cross, and like it's like if you're really the Son of God, like bring yourself down. And here it is, like the Son of God dies, and like, what do you make of that? Like, what do you make of like God, if he is really the Son of God, dying on a cross? Like, isn't that really the biggest downfall, the biggest letdown ever? Like, how could you not expect a miracle off the cross? I think that's really the point here. It's like, well, he died way too fast, which would probably be the same sort of idea of like, these stunk too fast. You know, he died before all the other two thieves. He didn't have to have his legs broken because he was already dead. Like, well, if he was really the son of God, at least he could have lasted a little bit longer. If he didn't like save himself, like he would have been up there for like 4 or 5 days at least, like as some sort of weird strength of miraculous sign, you know. But none of that happened, and he was the quickest, weakest, most humility, like, and that's not the story here. And like, I think that's really the biggest description of what is trying to be portrayed here by Dostoevsky in a much more like culturally apparent way.
Well, then I feel like we're back to Smerdyakov and Smerdyakov's whole point. Like, if they're going to torture you and no miracle is going to happen right then, why wouldn't you question your fate? Like, this book is just so genius because it's showing you from, you know, like when we hear Smerdyakov say that, we're like, oh, that's so clearly heresy. But then we see Alyosha's wrestling with the same question, right? Like, if your elder starts smelling and there's no miracle, aren't you going to have at least a moment of questioning in your soul? And then, like, I feel like we hear Paisley asking him, well, do you doubt now? Do you doubt now? So it's the same question. And I didn't think of that until just now. Like, he's wrestling with the same question as Smerdyakov.
Well, and the interesting point about comparing it to the crucifixion, which, my God, you just totally skipped over, is the fact that the miracle did come, but it didn't come till 3 days later.
Yes.
I mean, there
we haven't gotten there yet in the book either.
So I
don't know if it happens or not, but
yes, but it did look really bad at the time, and we had the same gathering of scoffers and scorners, you know, around. I appreciate those who have made some connections with the Grand Inquisitor chapters. I really do think that the theme of miracle and authority, miracle, mystery, and authority is definitely coming up here in a pretty overt way. It's interesting. There's this really fascinating little passage on page 331 where the narrator, who, by the way, has gotten very noisy in these chapters. I'll get to that in a minute. But the narrator is saying, well, why did the elder have this following? And he's saying it wasn't for miracles, not so much for miracles. It wasn't for his asceticism. He says, then, of course, and above all, this is why other people are mad at him. There was envy of the dead man's holiness, so firmly established while he lived that it was even forbidden, as it were, to question it. For though the late elder had attracted many to himself, here it is, not so much by miracles as by love, and had built up around himself, as it were, a whole world of those who loved him, nevertheless, and still more so, by the same means, he generated many who envied him, and hence became his bitter enemies, both open and secret, and not only among the monastics, but even among laymen. So it's really interesting that we have here kind of the Grand Inquisitor idea of, you know, sort of the rejection of the miracle. All you give is the faith in your holy ones and their love. And, you know, that's obviously being held up in Elder Zosima. But I think it's really interesting that that same love is also what generated his worst enemies. That's why people hate him, because he's good and they're not, you know. And that's a theme that keeps coming up too. You know, people get ashamed and reminded of their badness in the presence of other people, and like Rakitin hates Alyosha for that reason later on, you know.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I wonder, like, if Father Farapont is kind of like that idea of like asceticism without love, and
Yeah, totally.
That's all I had there.
I think that that's pretty much the defining thing. You know, it's weird because when you meet people who can be really aesthetically minded, if you're Roman Catholic, there are these group of people that are called rad trads, which is not meant to be a nice thing to call people. You know, like, they're very kind of specific people who tend to only want the Latin and only want, you know, they can be very outwardly pious, and they can be very big about asceticism, and I knew one who even wore a hair shirt, which I thought was really interesting, to say the least. But the big difference, again, it's about why are you doing it, and what is asceticism without love, and why is asceticism, how can asceticism even be driven if it's without love? And to me, again, I think it still goes back to this initial idea of fatherhood in a greater sense, not in a psychological, let's justify someone's behavior sense, but a trying to earn the, like, because why would people be so envious of Zosima? Why would people hate Zosima? It's because of envy. And the difference is one is proceeding out of kind of a knowledge or an experience of being loved, and the other one is almost like trying to become worthy of love in order to be loved. And I think that the nasty asceticism often comes from the belief that if I can do A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, then God will have to approve of me, and I will then become lovable. And the interesting thing about that being, I think the English word for it is pharisaical. And those, of course, the people who are saying, you know, Jesus, come down from the cross, is it's still a power game, because like the people who are challenging Jesus, come down from the cross, they believe that they are the righteous ones because they adhere to the standards that they create. They are able, therefore, to have control and power over the game of who becomes the acceptable and who doesn't become the acceptable. And I really think that the reason why, like, you see these people shown into factions, and they have to be shown into factions, is the reason why love becomes so divisive, and the reason why love creates so much resentment, is it really gets away from, it immediately wants to get away from us and them. It immediately wants to get away from, what do you have to do to earn your way into grace? What do you have to do to earn your way into acceptance? And I really do think that there's just this kind of very fundamental thing going on of who is coming out of a place of acceptance, of kind of a spiritual acceptance, of believing I don't have to earn grace, and therefore are capable of giving and being a source of grace, to those people who are almost fundamentally denying grace. And by denying grace, they, you know, everything is about justice all the time. Everything is, and so if you misstep, you know, in one thing, you know, I don't know, there's just this kind of fundamental divide that we see, and it's almost all about whether or not you're coming from a place of, you're being like a spiritual orphan, or being from a place where you feel like you have some security and belonging. And that's why I feel like the good father is trying not to get caught up in it, because I think he's trying to remind himself, what would his own elder have reminded him to be like in this situation? Are you coming from a place of spiritual security?
Father Paisi is a ripple effect of Father Zosimas. In other words, I think we see the whole Cain and Abel dynamic, which is, I think, is brilliantly explained by Micah here. That's I think if we want to go to the Orthodox fathers, I think it's the real explanation of Cain and Abel. Like, why did Cain kill Abel? It's because of jealousy over God's acceptance of his sacrifice from a pure heart versus trying to earn God's love. Just basically the same thing. So I think that was brilliant.
But like you mentioned earlier, the trajectory, you can't get into the outward trajectory and at the same time hold on to your control over the situation. And that's where the rubber meets the road.
Excellent thoughts, guys. We've spent quite a bit of time on this first chapter, and there's 3 more to go. So I'm going to move us along here a little bit. I want to talk about the narrator for a second, because the narrator practically becomes a character all of a sudden in these couple of chapters, and that'll be our bridge to the next chapter, because he kind of spends the whole first page loudly defending Alyosha's simplicity of heart here. But I just want to point out, in this chapter, he kind of keeps complaining how he hates having to relate this whole story, and this is a very silly reaction. And uh, I don't know. I just want to invite. I lost my train of thought there, but I want to invite your comments. Other people nodded when I said, "Boy, did the narrator get noisy." So I just found that kind of interesting. That all of a sudden, boom, he's got a lot to say and is really sharing his opinion kind of directly, and that's how we kick off an opportune moment. Is this big defense of Alyosha? Don't laugh at my hero. I would rather that he love earnestly with the simplicity than kind of be cold and, then will you ever find love, even though you're more rational or whatever. So jump in.
I loved the line about no doubt some other young man who has already learned how to love not ardently but just lukewarmly, whose thoughts, though correct, are too reasonable. I was like, oh, ouch, too close. It's I mean, it just in two lines that I feel like that describes my evolution over like 12 years, and it resonated very closely.
Yeah, the line that follows that, for a young man who is constantly too reasonable is suspect and of too cheap a price. That is my opinion.
I mean, to some extent, it's a counterpoint to we've been talking about some of the ways that Zosima and someone like Fairpont differ, where this emphasis on forgiveness, even if you don't stick to all the norms all the time, you can have your tea parties and still be a good monk. And in some ways, it's a reminder that doesn't mean that you should just say, well, it's not a big deal, no matter what. You still need to take these things. You still need to take, your faith incredibly seriously, and then that's what makes the forgiveness and sort of the grace of it count. Which is that you can't just let yourself become inured. But yeah, I don't know why the narrator takes it so hard.
I find that interesting, and one reason I bring it up, and this is maybe more of a literary technicality than is normal for our discussion group, but Dostoevsky is often referred to and held up as the author who doesn't interject a viewpoint and allows the characters to speak for themselves. And maybe the narrator himself is such a character, you could argue, obviously, but it is interesting that, like, here the narrator just comes right out and tells you what you should think. And that's what Dostoevsky is known for not doing. And maybe through the character as narrator, he's still not doing that. But it's really interesting that the narrator sometimes disappears completely in the background, but basically at the very beginning of the novel and right here has a lot of opinions and has a sort of personality that, you can kind of see coming into form. It's kind of like you're sitting down in a room with a guy, and then for most of the book, you completely forget he's there, but I just noticed that, and, this is literary geek, I guess, coming out, but.
Well, I was actually also going to point out when you said that he got noisy again, like all of a sudden, I was like, well, he was at the very, very beginning, so which you just brought up. And I think what I noticed, if I remember from when the narrator was more vocal at the beginning, and definitely now, the narrator has very, very strong feelings about Alyosha. Like at the very beginning, he's like, okay, this guy is my hero. This is the hero of the story. And he might not really seem like a hero. You might not think he's that heroic, but he is. So trust me. And here again, he's being very vocal in defense of Alyosha. So that seems to be kind of the linking. And then when Alyosha's just kind of sitting and listening to everybody else be philosophical, the narrator kind of backs off.
Yeah, and I think in one of these chapters somewhere, he again refers to him as my future hero, you know. So interesting little dynamic.
Like true to form. Yeah.
I would like to focus on Alyosha, the hero, for a second, because in chapter 2, we really start to get sort of what's going on inside him, and he is crushed from this whole turn of events. He seems to have personally shared the hopes, the secret hopes of the whole community that was expecting great things and miracles. But on 339, we get this really interesting explanation of why he's most deeply offended. And this is about halfway down the page. It's not that he needed the miracles. He says, again, it was not miracles he needed, but only a higher justice, which, as he believed, had been violated. And it was this that wounded his heart so cruelly and suddenly. And what matter if, in the course of events, that justice had assumed in Alyosha's expectations the form of those miracles expected immediately from the remains of his adored former teacher. What I'm really struck by here is how parallel this is to Ivan in Rebellion. What he needs is an immediate justice, a higher justice realized on earth now that I can see with my Euclidean mind, you know. And what's really painting Alyosha here is that this holy man, his hero, is being defamed and trampled upon by all these unjust fools, you know. And I was just really struck by Alyosha actually has the exact same problem as Ivan here, in a sense, that you know, this doesn't make sense. This world is crappy. And he even goes on later to say, you know, I don't reject God, I just reject his world. I cannot accept his world, or whatever. He really echoes multiple times very directly. You can almost hear Ivan's words ringing in his head as he's going through this temptation or trial or whatever. The next page, it's like he's getting mad at God for not choosing the miracle, just like the Grand Inquisitor and the temptation of Christ, like, throw yourself down and then they will believe that you're the Son of God, you know? And it's kind of like, why isn't God doing the miracle? Why is he choosing to let this holy man rot while everyone speaks badly and basically tramples on truth? Why don't you speak up? You know, here's top of 340. Why this sign, referring to the odor of corruption, which they now so triumphantly brought forth together with Father Farapont? And why did they believe they had any right to bring it forth? Where was providence in its finger? Why did it hide its finger at the most necessary moment? Alyosha thought, as wanting to submit itself to the blind, mute, merciless laws of nature. That was why Alyosha's heart was bleeding. I can't help but see how parallel this struggle is with Ivan's, you know, objections from Rebellion and Grand Inquisitor.
Absolutely. And it's not just that the world is terrible and it's not as it should be, but it's also that, you know, people have disappointed him in the same way that people have disappointed Ivan. You know, people have proven themselves to be, you know, cruel and unjust and petty in exactly the way that Ivan told him they would turn out to be. So I think his anger is not just at the divine, the lack of divine justice. It's at people who have proven to need it, or proven to need miracles.
I think this also really echoes the themes of Job that came up in the Zosima chapters, and Zosima kind of pointed that out as one of his favorite stories. And we really have a Job-like situation unfolding here. Here's the righteous man who is, you know, thrown down, and all his supposed friends and everyone come around and accuse him of like, you deserve this, you know. I couldn't help but notice that kind of language coming up in this section too.
Wait, hold on a sec. You're going fast. I wanted to just point out Alyosha's not just sounding like Ivan, he's quoting him. Like when he says, I do not accept his world, it's in quotes, and then he like gives a smile. Like I think it's not just an echo. He's very deliberately like, this has clearly been on his mind since talking to Ivan, and now he's living through it, and he quotes it. And then the very next page, where Keaton's like, wow, if only your dear brother Vinechka could hear you now, right? Like both of these characters kind of know he's quoting him too. So I just wanted to point that out, to be like, it's not just an echo, it's a deliberate quote.
No, it is. It's the where is God in my Euclidean mind? Like, it's questioning the ticket. What do I do with my ticket when my Euclidean mind can't conceive of this lack of justice or the way I think justice should be? Absolutely, Melissa.
So that was just me being a literary dork and being like, look at the quotation marks.
I thought I said that, but anyway, thank you for
you alluded to clear. She made it more strict.
Yeah.
Yeah, you brought it up, McGee. I just thought and I was flipping around looking for something, so maybe I misheard, but I thought some people were saying it sounds like he just sounds like him, and I was like, no, dude, he's quoting him. So that's all. Moving on. Job. Shall we talk about Job? Or you were going somewhere else, or I interrupted somebody else that was saying a thing?
Dude.
This is how I run my discussions.
What's interesting, though, is that even though he quoted Ivan, when Rakitin was like, oh, you're rebelling against God now, he said, no, I'm not rebelling against God. Where Ivan embraced the fact that he was rebelling against God.
Well, there is
same quote, just different.
Yeah, there's a slightly different accent on that, isn't there? Although Ivan himself did say, "Let's just accept God." You know, I accept God, although that was very unclear what that meant, because it also could mean we just made him up. But yeah, I think there's definitely something a little bit different happening in Alyosha with this struggle than in Ivan, even though they echo the same language. Like, he doesn't quite give up. And the narrator says a couple times, like, pure and simple, he still believes in God, but, you know, he's clearly going through something. Let's talk about Rakitin. If you didn't like, or if you didn't already hate Rakitin, here's your chance. Boy, is he absolutely awful, you know?
Yeah, he sucks.
He sucks farts.
Disgusting.
Exactly.
I was really disappointed that the sausage never came out.
If I had a nickel.
You win.
No one saw that coming.
Well, they would if the sausage came out.
Jesus.
What's funny though is like Rakitin sucks in a way that I think is hilarious. Like, I find him getting so pissed off. That's one of the parts that you're like, what's funny? That's funny to me, but I like, it's not haha funny. I don't know, just him getting madder and madder because he's like the worst villain ever. He'd come up with this plan to like ruin these two people, and it just like totally sucks. Instead, it's like saving their souls, and he's pouting about it.
No, he's just a character on a reality show on E, right? He's just like looking for drama and like looking for chaos.
He's totally on The Bachelor. He's
exactly.
Like, oh my gosh, Aaron, that's brilliant.
That's what I was thinking when I was reading it.
Well, there are those people that like take pleasure in other people's downfall. This is Rakitin, but it's like all of the other people at the funeral too. So it's like, I don't know.
No, but what's different about this is that he is intentionally poking at the biggest wound. This is the douchebag that, like, you just lost your dad or something, and he starts making fun of your dad to your face on the same day, like, and mocking. He's mocking Alyosha's love for Zosima, completely, flat out mocking it, like, over and over again, relentlessly. And I'm just like, it's actually amazing to see how Alyosha responds to this. Like, instead of just punching him in the face, you know, which most of us would do, he actually asks him nicely to stop a couple times. And you know, this is moving into the next chapter, I guess. But there's a incredibly, like, considerate rebuke. I can't remember where that is. Page 351, near the bottom, like, where Keaton has just been, I think he just made a toast to the gates of paradise or something. Like, what a douchebag. That's the douchiest moment in the whole thing. Like, you know, to the gates of paradise, you're an asshole. You know, he's just mocking him with a toast. And here's this kind of amazing outburst from Alyosha. Rakitin, he suddenly said loudly and firmly, "Don't taunt me with having rebelled against my God. I don't want to hold any anger against you, and therefore you be kinder too. I've lost such a treasure as you never had, and you cannot judge me now. You'd do better to look here at her. Did you see how she spared me?" And he goes on with this kind of beautiful statement. I was like, wow, how did he pull that off? You know? Does anyone want to say anything else about the opportune moment chapter, or shall we talk about the onion and the whole Grushenka? Let's open up.
Let's move to Grushenka
On the third chapter here in Onion.
Well, I can't help but think that it is continuing the theme of sort of ripples that you are always bringing up, McG. In this case, I think we start to see the negative ripples, right? That Grushenka has acted in the way that she has done to hurt so many people because she herself was so grievously hurt at one point. And then we quickly see the opposite, that like all it took was Alyosha seeing this little bit of good in her, and she starts to be a changed person. She just needed to be understood. Like, she needed someone to understand and see her for what she was. And I will remind everyone, this is coming from the person who early on hated Grushenka, like with the fervor which McG is hating Rakitin right now. Like, did not like her at all.
I wanted to start off this chapter asking a question, like, is it surprising that Grushenka shows such interest towards Alyosha? Like, why is she so drawn to him? They've barely crossed paths, and there seems to be this whole background history. I thought that was a sort of surprising revelation.
Again, I'm not a literature nerd like some of you, so this might be the 14-year-old's reading of this or whatever. But like, it's her guy had ruined her, so maybe she's out to ruin this. I mean, the book calls him like an inexperienced virgin, right? I mean, like, so maybe she's looking to like perpetuate her hurts.
I was gonna say the same thing, essentially.
Well, and I think what you were saying earlier, McG, about was it you? I think it was you who were saying it about the characters hating people that were better than them, and that just like pisses them off. That seems to be part of her rage. Is every time she saw him, he'd had this, which is interesting because that also sort of mirrors Ivan, right? Like, he had this life she didn't have. He seems to be a good person, so she's going to ruin him now because nobody should be that good. Which seems like also the reason Rakitin brought him there, right? Like, yeah, I'm going to show you, Alyosha. Get your Grushenka, you won't be so good. Like, everyone just wants to prove that other people are as base as they are.
Well, I think there's also something, another dimension or angle of that is that for whatever reason, he particularly and constantly reminds her of her own shame and how much she doesn't like herself, you know? And then it's a kind of revenge on him for being that good. Like, oh, well, you're not actually different if I can bring you down, right?
Well, and that makes sense too, because I feel like that's another parallel with Ivan, where there was this concern about money that I think both Ivan and Grushenka share in different ways, right? They know where their livelihood comes from, and both of them have a lot of shame about what they've had to do to get a livelihood. And I do feel like one of the hard and sometimes troubling things about reading Dostoevsky now is the anti-Semitism that crops up, like in this chapter, in a big way, right? But I think like that's supposed to be signaling to us that she's someone who cares too much about money in the same way that Ivan does. But I was like, as a good teacher, I can't help, like, I have to flag it and say, like, it's pretty horrifying the way it's getting coded that she is, like a Jew in the way that she uses money.
Isn't it like your grandparents' racism, where you're supposed to like say it's folksy but tell them to stop? Like you don't get mad at them, but you're just like, well, we don't do that now.
Before we totally lose the shame topic, I just want to also point out the parallel with Fyodor, and how he's so ashamed of himself. He always has to lash out at other people. When he feels like a fool, he makes more a fool of himself, and then he lashes out, and we see Grushenka doing a bit of that. We also see Rakitin doing quite a bit of that in this chapter. Like the scene when he suddenly gets revealed as having, made a deal to betray Alyosha for 25 rubles, which has all kinds of Judas overtones to it. And he tries to play it off, in the moment. But then later on, as they walk back to the monastery, Alyosha's not even thinking about it anymore, and Rakitin brings it up again, like, "Oh, I bet you think you're better than me for like, I'm not a Judas. You're no Jesus Christ either, And Alyosha's like, "What are you talking about, bro? I left that behind way back there." And then Rakitin's like, "Whatever, man. I'm out of here. You suck. Don't ever talk to me again." Which is, definitely coming from this place of shame that makes you lash out at other people, and you can see that Grushenka started with that instinct towards Alyosha to some extent. Carry on.
My point bringing up the whole money thing was about shame. It was that, like, in that first chapter when we met Alyosha, remember, it was emphasized so heavily that he is the person that you could drop in the middle of any city and he'd be taken care of, and he wouldn't be a burden, and he wouldn't have shame about it, right? He seems to have this freedom from that kind of shame that both Ivan cannot get. Ivan is like so mired down by how miserably he feels about money, and it seems like Grushenka has some of that too, even though she's never, like, I thought, like you were saying, why does she have this particular like fixation on Alyosha? And it seems like there's certain categories, right? It's not like he doesn't seem to have shame about money. That so many characters, from Snegriev to Ivan to Fyodor to Grushenka, like they're all, and Dmitri, like all of them are so worried about where money's coming from, and he doesn't have that, and that seems to make a lot of rage in a lot of them.
I think shame keeps you where you're at. Like, it's got a pride component. It's like kind of seeing, it's kind of like a false, like seeing yourself for who you are, but like not accepting it, and like and pridefully wanting to continue in that sort of vein. And like, I think everyone's talking about shame here, and it's like totally legitimate, like how that works with all of these characters as they deal with their own shame, as they see themselves for like evil, but they don't want to change, and they're more happy to like bring others to their level versus raising themselves out of that level. And now we're talking about the onion and like bringing yourself out of hell, and like seeing like how it's not so much about like getting yourself out, but like not getting sucked in and being happy, or like being miserable where you're at, but wanting other people to share in your misery. Like, I think that's like kind of like the counterpoint here. I don't know if that made any sense or not, but
yeah, well, and turning the conversation a little bit from shame having to do with money back to shame having to do with sex. I mean, if you are someone who has bought into or had thrown at you your whole life, the kind of virgin whore dichotomy, that's not something you can pull yourself out of. You can't be like, oh yeah, I'm a virgin again. That's not the way it works. That kind of shame is completely different. And on that subject, did anyone else, especially Melissa, because you're the other female, but maybe the guys too, just want to yell at Grushenka that whole chapter not to go back to the guy who hurt her several years ago? Just don't go back to him. Don't do it.
Maybe he's changed.
Yeah, I mean, whether he's changed and whether she wants to be with him or whether she wants to kill him with a knife, she shouldn't do it. She shouldn't do either one.
No, Jenny, he didn't change. That was a joke.
Yeah. That was, I mean, the whether he's changed was kind of, yeah, with an eye roll that you couldn't see.
I was joking. We never change.
Anytime you're asking, am I going to bring a knife, you might want to like rethink some of your choices. That might be a good life rule.
Yes. And like, if you can't decide whether you want to be with him and like marry him or kill him with a knife, maybe don't marry him. Maybe that's a terrible idea.
Also, why is it that every girl in this situation in this book calls up Alyosha on this question? You guys notice that? They're like, decide my fate for me, you know? And then he's like,
because he's not going to hurt them. Because he's a virgin too.
I know, but they're always asking. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Did Dostoevsky have a like nice guys finish last complex? Is that why he's doing this?
It's interesting that like how many times does Alyosha get asked his opinion on whether someone's in love and who they should be with? And he always tries to answer, and you always are like, oh, Alyosha, I don't know if you're right about that.
He might have a good heart and see things clearly, but dude has never been in a relationship.
Yeah,
so
don't ask him for the relationship advice.
It's kind of like asking a monk for relationship advice.
I mean,
right? Because
right?
if you ask anybody who knows and has ever been in a relationship, they'll tell you to go be by yourself and become a monk. So,
well, most monks don't actually do that, which is what they probably should do because that's what they know. But
well, but I mean, who else are you going to ask for relationship advice? There's really nobody good to ask.
Yeah, definitely not Rakitin.
Right.
Smerdjakov. I bet Smerdjakov gives great.
I was thinking
advice.
Smerdjakov.
Yes, you and me, Aaron.
He's gonna get his guitar. It's gonna be fun.
Or drunk Fyodor. I'm sure he could tell you some great like poetry, some Schiller, whatever.
They're all women. It don't matter.
So yeah, I mean, Alyosha might not have any experience and might not know what the hell he's talking about, but his intentions are at least going to be okay. Unlike most everybody else.
Touche.
So let's talk about. Does anyone have any question they want to pose to the group about this chapter?
I mean, I want to talk about it more. You're not moving on yet, are you?
No. I'm not moving on. I'm giving someone else a chance to set the agenda.
I was just
Come on,
gonna chip
Taggy,
in
flip
on-
it. Oh, David.
Oh, yeah, me.
David.
I was just going to tag on to the whole relationship advice thing. The only other person who gave Grushenka relationship advice was old Samsonov, who told her to marry Fyodor, just make sure that like you get some money up front. And that was it. That was his advice. So like it makes sense that she's looking for advice for like somebody who has compassion, somebody who shows a sense of love for others. Even if he doesn't have relationship experience, relationships shouldn't be boiled down to a business transaction, and everybody else in her life is just seemingly out to like, I don't know, get power over each other, get a better deal, get something. It's nice to seek an alternative.
I just love that, David. I think that's I think that's brilliant. Looking right back into the whole entire like funeral debacle of before, like this whole relationship of Elder Zosimus and how it's like supposedly supposed to be like this power thing or this like monetary view of things. Like, well, he was a better elder or a better monk than anyone else, so therefore he needs to have a miracle like type of play. But we see the non-linear view of like faith and holiness and mercy and love. Like it, there's like what is the accounting of mercy and love? And I think that's like the central question of this book. But like kind of seeing how this all kind of fits together in like a different perspective of love between like or relationships between man and wife or man and woman or whatever it might be. But it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and just as Mike has pointed out in several weeks past, the whole dynamic between power and love and the struggle between the two. I mean, Alyosha understands love. He understands unconditional love. From a lot from Elder Zosima, but also from his own experiences and gifts in life. I mean, he might not understand romantic love. He doesn't understand sexual politics. Those are the other kind of flip sides of when we say he doesn't understand relationships. But he understands unconditional love better than most.
And I think to tie this back full circle, the opening question I asked for this chapter of, why does Grushenka seem so fascinated by Alyosha? She gives her first motive as he upsets me because he reminds me that I'm not worthy or I'm bad or whatever, and so I want to bring him down to my level. But I think we could definitely say that actually she's intrigued by him because he's different and seems to have something different that no one else can give or whatever. And so when she actually gets him in the room, she doesn't go forward with the original plan. She's now really excited that for the first time she has someone she can talk to freely and actually open up. It's like she's been waiting for someone to come into her life who will listen to her, not judge her, and will not see her as a bunch of labels slapped on from the outside and stuck in these roles that she doesn't want to. It's like he's actually giving her a chance to be a human being for the first time.
Well, I think like Grushenka is like a very like dynamic creature or character in this novel. Like here we see a person that like is searching for love and she's finding it in all the wrong places with all these different guys and like trying to find like true love.
Too many places. Sorry, someone had to do that.
Yeah. But she's not getting there. She's not finding it. And her existence of love is just bringing someone to where she's at, perhaps. And maybe that's all of our experiences with love, is trying to find someone that's willing to go to where we are at. And unfortunately that happens to be in some sort of sensuality or banality or something like that. But here we have the counterpoint of love that's not going to the sensuality, but actually striking at something even deeper than that, of true intimacy, where someone can actually see someone else and the humanity within that other person, the true essence of that being. I think that's what we experience here in this chapter with Alyosha and Grushenka. And it's like transformative, and it's not like just perpetuation like Rakitin of trying to get someone down to your level in order to create some sort of strife, which is maybe the world's definition of love or something like that, where you can then reject and cause pain and suffering, but actually healing and transformation.
Let's talk about the onion fable and the idea of who gives an onion in this chapter and how that works.
I think I just explained that. Sorry.
Well, we'll let another have a go at it.
But I feel like the onion story is another way of getting at that idea you've brought up, McG, that ripple idea, right? That maybe all holiness is, in some cases, is just becoming capable of love, so we can do small things for the people around us, and that becomes magnified into, like, that's the real miracle, is that sometimes we're capable of being a human to others in the face of horribleness, and that can grow way more than we ever thought it could be. There, I said a thing about the onion.
And I think it's also illustrating the importance that something that I struggle with, because like the problems of the world are too much and too crazy and make me too angry, and I feel like I can't do anything. And I feel like the onion parable is also a reminder that just do something small. Just do something small, and it can make a difference even if you can't do everything.
So can we all start reading this chapter instead of having to hear the starfish story one more time at any sort of motivational speech? No one knows what I'm talking about? The one boy on the beach picking up the starfish, throwing them one at a time. No one else has had to listen to that inspirational
I hate that
speech.
story.
Right, like couldn't we let's read this chapter of Brothers Karamazov instead? Ow. I just got my headphones caught. Hold on.
You okay?
Yeah, they got caught in the wheels of my office chair. It was really...
Taggy, do you have a flask right now?
Is it full of cognac? Please tell me it's full of cognac.
Unfortunately, no. It's Scotch this time.
What scotch are you drinking out of a flask?
It's some cheap stuff.
Very well.
I saw you make good choices over there, Aaron. I saw that happening. Fuller's ESB, yeah.
Did you get one too, husband?
No, no, I'm still on my first beer.
He's shaming me.
The turning point in this chapter, and the actual onion that Grushenka seems to be referring to, is a tiny little thing, which is basically when Rakitin is making all these jokes and making his dumb toast to the gates of paradise, being an absolute bore. And Grushenka suddenly finds out that Zosima died today. She suddenly jumps off Alyosha's lap, where she's been sort of flirting with him. And he's like, I am so sorry. You know, like, I didn't know, like, forgive me. And then Alyosha seems to be really profoundly moved by this. I'm kind of surprised at just how deeply moved Alyosha is by this. Did anyone else have comments about that reaction?
Okay, I totally didn't think about this till just this second. When you were saying about how he's moved by it. But there's almost a parallel between he's moved because she stops trying to seduce him. Is that a parallel to Ivan and Katerina, or whatever her name is? No, I'm sorry, Dmitri. I'm getting all the names mixed up. When she goes for the money and she thinks she's going to have to sleep with him, and then she doesn't. I'm sorry, I just thought of this, so it's like not.
No, that's really interesting.
I've got other Ivan Katerina connections to make later, but I didn't notice that one, and I think that's brilliant because I think at this point in the book, Alyosha's in such great despair that there is no justice in the world, basically, that he's decided to go and destroy himself because the world has no meaning for him, and so he's agreed to go along to Grushenka, knowing pretty full well that like she's going to try to, seduce him, and that's what Rakitin wants. And he's like, whatever, I'll break the monastic fast. I'll eat meat. I'll have vodka, and I'll go have sex with the kept woman or whatever. And I think up until this point, he really hasn't made up his mind, or he's just sort of like, whatever, you guys just do whatever you want to me, and I'm just going to go ahead and go along and ruin myself. And when he suddenly sees this moment that she has compassion for him because he's just lost. I mean, I think it's somehow profoundly shocking that in this sudden moment, when everyone else is mocking the elder, who is the one that's not mocking the elder? Grushenka, like the one you'd maybe least expect it from, who's called herself evil, who, you know, played this nasty trick on Katerina the other day, you know, who seems to be kind of calculating and gets what she wants. And then all of a sudden she's the one that's extending this human dignity to him. And like, you know, it seems to be all he needs to suddenly change course and kind of come out of the despair somehow. And then that sets off this chain reaction where he says, she just saved me. And Rakitin's like, really? She just saved you? She was going to eat you up, you know? And she tells her onion story. She's like, no, Rakitin, I gave an onion. And that was it, was jumping off his lap, I guess, letting him grieve. But he goes on to give his own onion in exchange. Now that she's freed him from that despair, he's able to say, look, she actually has a lot of love in her heart. She was very generous with me a second ago. And what is oh man, maybe someone else can chime in because I'm losing the context. What is the gift that Alyosha gives to her? Because he gives something back, and why and what is it specifically? He's at some point he's saying, oh, here it is, 355.
He gives her dignity.
Yeah, well, but what specifically? Why?
One, he like it's everything you're saying on 355. It's like it's the whole orthodox idea of the gospel we were talking about, where you say you're lower than anyone else, and saying that to another person, in this case, to a person who's already like abusing herself. It, you know, he says right to her, she is higher in love than we are, and he literally says, like, I came here not as a judge. Oh, I just lost it. But he basically says, as the lowliest of the accused. It's that moment, right? Like, I am of sinners, of whom I am first. And in that moment, she's able to, like, that's, I think, what he gives her. That moment of being able to say, no, you're not the lowest. I am. You are high in love. Like, what you just gave me is, like, he's able to see her. Which I have to point out, the thing I wanted to point out is, like, it didn't strike me until y'all were saying this. This is so freaking gospel, right? Like, the kept woman turns out to be the holiest one, while all the strictly religious practitioners turn out to be hypocrites that just want to drag down holiness. This is a little mini gospel here.
Yeah, and I think actually what we missed in the middle, why I kept wanting to go back to the concrete here, like what was the gift Alyosha gave? Well, first, she had to tell her whole story. So she has this moment of incredible vulnerability explaining her history with this officer who betrayed her and ruined her. And she opens up about how she's been, you know, weeping on the floor and tormenting her own heart. And that's part of Alyosha's thing too. Like, why is this woman so great? Look at what she just did. Have you ever heard someone speak like this before, so openly, you know, and vulnerably? And that seems to make this opening possible for the two to recognize something beautiful in each other and to kind of change trajectory. It's just amazing how they both completely alter each other in these tiny little exchanges, like the onion they give back and forth. I'm really struck by how a complete change in demeanor comes over both of them. Whereas Rakitin sits in the background and makes like MST3K comments the whole way through. And some of his language actually reminds me of Smerdikov. He says, fools exist for the intelligent man's profit, which is his defense of why he can accept 25 rubles, you know, to betray his friend. There was a little, you know, I'm just hearing echoes of Smerdikov's. It's always interesting to talk to an intelligent man. That happened in the last chapter too, where Rakitin starts mocking Alyosha for actually believing in miracles, and says, "Oh, I always regarded you as an educated man," you know. So I felt a couple Smerdikov echoes. I want to get to my Katerina echo. What was that though? In some way, Grushenka and Katerina have some really big similarities here. I'm sorry, I'm losing my place in my notes. This is really frustrating me. There's some point where she says, I think I might have fallen in love with the wrong that was done to me. I'm in love with the wrong, not the man anymore. And that sounded an awful lot like Katerina and Dmitri, you know, where she's sort of pursuing him to her own ruin, and kind of keeps reopening the wound. Grushenka talks about how like she sort of picks at the wound for comfort or something like that. And that's an idea that I think the narrator said at some point way earlier in the book, that, you know, I think it was about the grieving mother, actually. Like, Gesundheit.
Sorry,
I thought my mic was off.
But I actually thought reading this, wow, Grushenka and Katya have quite a bit in common in terms of motivation and inner brokenness there. And they make great enemies as a result for some reason.
Well, they also have the parallel of forgiveness. You know, there's this man who has wronged them in both cases, who they make a big show of forgiving. And I mean, Grushenka doesn't have a whole speech about how she's going to save him, but I think there's a little bit of that undertone in her going back to him, because she and Alyosha talk a lot about forgiving him, which would also be a parallel of Katya, you know, forgiving Dmitri and wanting to stay by him even if he was going to go run off to Grushenka every night.
I finally found the quote I was actually referring to. It's 356. This is Grushenka. I've grown terribly fond of my tears. Maybe I've come to love only my wrong, not him at all.
In love with your sadness. I underlined that as well.
Seems to be a common theme to me. All these people just want to be right in their own ways, and it's like almost like a comfort. Whether it's Rakitin, whether it's Katerina, whether it's Grushenka, whether it's any of these characters, like we all want to be wrong in our own way, and we want to drag other people to that point because it provides us some solace in some sort of sick, sort of twisted way. But the real thing is like when someone like Alyosha has like a different perspective and like is able to elevate you and like trying to change your perspective, like things happen. Like it's kind of strange. It's that little ripple effect, I think. The dissonance ripple.
This is going backwards, but I just found a quote from Grushenka where she explains her perception of the gift that Alyosha gave her. This is the about a third way down page 357. You know, she's rebuking Rakitin for being a jerk again. Keep still, you wicked soul. Never said anything like what he came and told me. Just what did he tell you? Rakitin grumbled irritably. I don't know what he told me. My heart heard it. He wrung my heart. He's the first to pity me and the only one, that's what. Why didn't you come before, you cherub? She suddenly fell on her knees to him as if beside herself. All my life I've been waiting for such a one as you. I knew someone like that would come and forgive me. I believed that someone would love me, a dirty woman, not only for my shame. And then Alyosha's like, well, what did I do for you? You know, I didn't really do it. I just gave you an onion.
I've been waiting for a monk like you. Come into my
Uh,
life.
I also think it's interesting. I mean, Grushenka is such a dynamic character in this chapter. And it's like this sort of illumination or epiphany or enlightenment happens that Alyosha offers in the sudden acceptance and love. And you hear some moments of sort of rapturous, like, I'm going to go live a good life now. And then the next moment it's like, or maybe I'm going to kill this guy, you know, wicked, you know, I haven't made up my mind yet. I think she's very complex, and it's like interesting to see a different path open, and she's really considering it and just really kind of caught in that indecision. I don't know what to do. Like, what do I do with this guy? Do I go back and be with him? Then I'm going to be ashamed, and also he's a jerk. Do I revenge myself on him? Do I go with Alyosha's new path, and what would that even be? You know.
Yeah, I'm going to call it the Dissonance Ripple, which might be another band name.
It's probably progressive metal. Does anyone have any other perspectives or insights on this chapter? They want to chime in?
I like one more aspect of sort of the dissonance ripple, which is Rakitin, when he accepts the money, he's embarrassed to be ashamed that he is accepting the money, which is a wonderfully complex little feeling. And sort of, you know, Rakitin and Smerdikov and Ivan all sort of have, you know, these weird, gross nihilist echoes of one another. And somehow for Rakitin, like, it's embarrassing and impossible that he should feel decently, you know, feel the right and appropriate thing towards somebody else. And it reminded me in some ways of, you know, again, Ivan had said he doesn't think it's possible to love somebody else. He doesn't understand how it's possible to love somebody else. And sort of, you know, one wonders, would Ivan at this point even recognize that feeling if he felt it, or would he be embarrassed by that feeling if he found it in himself, and would he actively reject it or pretend it didn't exist in the way that Rakitin did? You know, Ivan was maybe struggling with something like that as he was listening to Fyodor downstairs in the previous chapter, a couple of chapters ago. But I think that was a cool echo.
Well, I think it's an interesting, like, dissonance ripple for him. It's causing this, like, strife inside of something that he didn't consider before possible. Like, that he would be embarrassed by accepting money for doing something that was normal to him. Like, now he's been changed as, like, a periphery. He experienced this exchange between Grushenka and Alyosha, and he is in fact changed by this, and it's that dissonance that's rippling out forward from this central act. So, amazing.
And that actually, I like that echoes, going back to something we were talking about earlier, one of the differences between Ferapont and Zosima, where what Ferapont does he doesn't create dissonance. Ooh, we have another cat. What Ferapont does is he confirms what people kind of expect to be true, whereas Zosima, even when he's given the role of holy fool, you know, argues with people about whether he's, you know, whether they're treating him correctly as a holy fool, whether, you know, whether he should be, you know, whether they're taking him seriously in the right way, and so on. So Zosima goes out of his way to create dissonance in a way that Ferapont doesn't. Anyway. That's enough onion talk for me.
I'm sorry, Jason, did you just say something backwards? Did you just say Zosima creates dissonance? and Farapont doesn't?
That's
Does it
what
mean
I
that's the other way
meant.
around?
No, because I think that Zosima does go out of his way to confuse people, or in a productive way. He doesn't. He doesn't make them comfortable in a way that Farapont does. Farapont, people say, "Oh, holy fool," and Farapont goes and does holy fool stuff, and also tells them kind of what they want to hear.
Televangelist style.
Televangelist style.
Okay.
Except I've never heard a televangelist say, only to live on bread and water.
Well,
and live a hard life.
if a televangelist was defined as only live on bread and water, I'm sure Joel Osteen would do the same. I mean,
He
come
wants
on.
you to be rich.
Yeah. I live on bread and water and I'm rich. And fill in the rhyming word that ends that sentence. But
I'm sensing that we're done with the Onion chapter. So let's move on to Cana of Galilee. I'm really
Wait, before we move on, can I do one more thing?
yes,
no.
but we can't see your face, David. We can only see the top of your head.
I'm sorry, I was looking at my book. I think I had a brief moment of thinking of the movie I Heart Huckabees in the Onion chapter, like towards the end of the movie, where everybody realizes that people are assholes to each other. Everybody causes each other pain, and yet when you put like two really broken people together, you can have this moment of profound connection and love and support for each other. And to me, that kind of seemed like what was happening here between Grushenka and Alyosha. Two people who don't have anything in common other than the fact that they're in this moment just feeling completely broken, and all they need is somebody to be there broken with them. And that was I think that's kind of where they just started connecting, helping each other out, feeling each other's pain, and moving forward from there. And Rakitin, for all of his scheming, couldn't understand that, couldn't break through that, couldn't anything that he did to try to make their pain worse only backfired on him, because they both were like connected about that same pain. They were feeling the same pain that he was causing, and in that light, it was completely ineffective and was turned around on him as not just ineffective, but was actually helping them to like love each other better.
That's awesome. I just love the effect of like Rakitin trying to tie these two people against each other, but it's like that idea that like that against each other has failed so catastrophically that it's like revealed their brokenness to each other, and through their brokenness they've then turned that on its head. That's amazing.
And it's also really interesting to watch Rakitin react when this simply does not fit in his world. Like, for Rakitin, a miracle actually just happened, and he's like, "What the hell?" Like, these are unimaginable behaviors to him. He just really can't understand non-self-calculating kind of act of mercy.
From broken people.
And then the narrator actually goes out of his way to say at one point, I'm not sure exactly where, but that Rakitin basically is so egotistical and so self-absorbed. I don't think he uses the word narcissistic, but basically he is, that he doesn't understand other people's feelings, like at all.
Yeah, well, Grushenka says at one point something like, "I'm gonna burn off my face and cut it with a knife," and then she just like starts crying, and Rakitin is like, let's go. Like we should go now. Like that was his response.
Yeah, I don't think he's a narcissist. I think he's a sociopath.
If you guys are ready, we'll move on to the last chapter, Cana of Galilee. So before we get to discussing the dream itself that occupies kind of the center of this chapter, I want to talk a little bit about the first page where Alyosha returns to the monastery and finds himself basically overcome with sweetness and joy. He beholds the elder in the coffin, and he's just kind of at peace here. And my question is, why? What happened? Like, how did he get here? What changed in Alyosha that has averted this whole crisis? And he's no longer raging against the injustice of the mockery of his elder. And now he can come in and kind of be at peace there in the same exact situation.
I think because he saw a miracle, to be honest. Like, he saw a miracle based on the whole premise of what Elder Zosima stood for. And it's that miracle that's transformative. And it's not the blatant miracle, it's the personal miracle. It's the miracle of seeing, like, a harlot come to knowledge and change her ways, and for him personally to see himself like dejected and horrified and finding beauty in something else that was considered ugly to everyone else. Like, it's the whole like 180 that he experienced, like in that whole interchange, that made everything make sense to him. That's what I take. I went straight for the jugular, so I'm sorry.
Well, I don't know. I think I take issue a little bit with calling, like, Grushenka's transformation a harlot changing her ways. I think I don't know. It's sort of more and also less than that. I think it's the human connection. It's that he was able to give her an onion, but that she also gave him one. I mean, it was a two-way street. It wasn't just Grushenka was transformed.
Thank you for saying that.
I don't think I tried to make that case, but I totally agree with that.
Okay. Yeah, it was something about the way you phrased it.
Yeah.
Might not have been quite the way you meant it, but yeah.
Well, I think every miracle is like transformative to everyone that's involved. So yeah, obviously Alyosha had a part to play, and he saw that happen, and Grushenka had a part to play as well. And it's like it's reciprocal, and it's like it's communal. It's not isolationist, and everything there just all of a sudden just like clicked for him. Like here he was in despair, and like through the elder's instruction, like this miracle took place, and it was like through him working, but also through receiving something from somebody else. And it's a communal aspect. It's not one-sided. And that might be going a little bit too far in terms of the scope here, but it's my understanding of miracles anyway.
Does anyone else have another thoughts to add to this?
I'm getting cut off.
Yes, you are. What is the miracle of Alyosha? Why is he suddenly able to be at peace and joyful?
The banal kind of explanation would be that he's sort of enacting what Zosima talked about very early on in the book, which is that when you find your faith shaken, practice active love, and you'll kind of maybe and you'll get through it, and things will get better. What he said to the woman of little faith early on, who was having trouble, I think, loving and caring for the people that she was nursing, something like that. And so, again, yeah, kind of banally, he's, done the practice, and the faith has followed. It would be maybe the null hypothesis version.
Can't it be inexplicable as well?
I think.
I like a good null hypothesis. I am a scientist.
I don't know what that means, but I actually was really glad you said it, Jason. And I think if there's any negative connotation what you said, I reject that. I think that was actually a great point, that he took the elder's advice and came out, like, if you actually go out and actively love and you receive and experience that yourself, that's how you kind of have this connection that sustains you or whatever. Faith in the elder is restored, or what he needs, he got, I guess, somehow from that.
That's not a bad thing. It's just the state of being as you would think it was.
I think it's more beyond the elder and more towards Alyosha at this point. Like, I think it's that relationship, that real active experience of active love that's transformed Alyosha away from his faith in the elder towards that of being active. And he's been personally transformed. And it's not so much like he's been transformed so that he sees the elder as something better, but that he's been personally transformed so that he understands everything that the elder ever said.
I think it's important to note, too, that, I mean, the chapter's called Cana of Galilee. It was just, I'm breaking up.
Yeah, I missed most of that.
Okay, I'm trying to rejoin.
Sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut her off, but I didn't want to miss everything she was trying to say.
I couldn't
No,
hear
I mean,
her.
that no one could understand anything that was happening there. So we'll get her back on and tell her to turn off the video and try again. Let us know when you can hear, Liz.
I can hear. Can you hear me?
Okay, turn off your video and try again.
Well, is it working right now with the video?
Yes.
Just do it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm
Do it.
I hate being just a still screen. Unless it's not working again. Is it not working?
It's so dicey that you need to turn off the video. I'm going to do it too, because our connection's bad. So
I mean, okay.
Well, the nice smiling face Melissa is always good too. So.
No, it's creepy. It's too close. It's freaking me out. Plus, then I can't talk with my hands. It doesn't work. But can people hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So I was going to say, I feel like it's important that the chapter is called Cana of Galilee, and Alyosha's having all of these realizations while Paisi is reading this part of the gospel, right? So that clearly to me seems like it's some part of the key here. And it's interesting to me because, like, the story of Cana of Galilee is a story of a literal material miracle, right? The water turned into wine. But Alyosha is having this experience of that story where what seems to be coming out to him, like, the miracle isn't that water got turned into wine. The miracle is that Jesus came and hung out and thought it was important enough to go to a wedding with a bunch of poor people. Like, I mean, he's saying literally physically poor people, and turn their water into wine, right? Like, the miracle to him isn't this material supernatural thing. It's that God cared enough to hang out at a wedding and try and bring people joy. So that seems to be like connecting to some of what Taggy was saying, I think, too, about the sort of transformation that's about love, that he's having this realization that that's at the heart somehow, is like Jesus being love. Does that make any sense? Well,
you've answered the question before I even asked it, which was coming up next, which is, what is the significance of this gospel story appearing here? And the reflection that Christ came to help man's joy and visited joy, not grief, with his first miracle.
Sorry. You can pay me 25 rubles later for totally nailing that discussion topic.
Well, it's
Anyone
just
wanna
like
respond? But
it's kind of interesting to say like water into wine. And it's like this idea of like just what is a miracle, right? And if a miracle is turning water into wine, it's like turning this like really basic, easy to accomplish thing into something that's like really quite technically difficult. It's like you got to pick the grapes, you got to mash the grapes, you got to ferment the grapes, then you got to like purify it, clean it, put it in a bottle, and then finally you have wine. Like 12 weeks later, or even more. And it's like the wedding of Cana is just like go fill up these jugs full of water, and like here it is, like transformed into wine, like this brilliant miracle. This little idea of like this onion, this little thing offered forward that then is created into like this huge life-changing experience, I think is like the whole key. But that's every miracle, I guess. But
we have been kind of dancing around the vision. Let's go ahead and talk about it. The dream. It's a very interesting dream sequence here where you start out with just hearing the story itself, and then gradually Alyosha finds himself in the story, and then the elder's there, and then there's echoes of conversations they've just been having, and I find it a pretty interesting little sequence. So your reflections on the dream.
His teacher said, "Do your work, son. Do work."
One of the things that I found really interesting about this vision is that the feast is full of those who only gave an onion. And Zosima, who himself is probably the best example in the whole book of someone who actually did a lot of great deeds of love, he basically says, "What are deeds? I gave an onion." It's like anybody can be here. Everyone is invited here. It doesn't take that much. I really love the way it progresses from that conversation with the elder to the elder reflecting on I'm sorry. It progresses from there to the elder telling Alyosha, like, look at our son. Do you see him? Like, look at the Lord or whatever. And Alyosha is like, I'm afraid. I don't dare to look. And this goes back to what a few people said earlier about maybe shame and trying to earn love or whatever. And we get this really beautiful passage from Zosima. Do not be afraid of him. Awful is his greatness before us. Terrible is his loftiness, yet he is boundlessly merciful. He became like us out of love, and he is rejoicing with us, transforming water into wine, that the joy of the guests may not end. He's waiting for new guests. He's ceaselessly calling new guests, now and unto ages of ages. See, they are bringing the new wine. The vessels are being brought in. That was a real powerful passage for me, somehow, the way it was all set up, the way this feast is full of people that just gave an onion, and it's like, and I want you here too. And it's just like the doors are swung wide here. I was very moved by this section.
Me too. Sounds trite, but it's true.
I was moved on the next page, or I guess on the continuation of that page, of his response to it, and how it seemed to be like he got called into the union of all things, and like God was all things. Like the bottom of page 362, how connected everything was after his elder had come to him in a dream and reaffirmed his faith in his mission.
I agree. It's like you see him suddenly being infused with everything the elder taught, and it's becoming real for him in that moment. It's like this isn't just sayings anymore. He suddenly seems to accept them, like they just sink in and become very present. And all of a sudden, he is filled with this desire to love all the earth and the plants and kiss the ground and ask forgiveness of the stars or whatever. And that language again about asking forgiveness for all crops up, and he seems to really believe it now. And it's like some giant transformation just happened inside him here. What happened to him? What changed for Alyosha here in the vision of the elder? Because it's like we had a change from Grushenka returning to the monastery. There seemed to be a change that really knocks him to the ground, basically, in the vision of the elder.
Taggy.
Mute your microphone if you're going to walk around, Michael.
There was can I say something personal to you, McG?
Michael, mute your phone. Okay, go.
McG, can I say something personal to you despite Taggy's lack of self-awareness and total rudeness?
Yes.
It reminded me of a conversation we had that like bridged my divide between like teetering between Unitarianism and atheism and rejoining Christianity when I was upset with the state of Christianity and all the people who call themselves Christians, and you were like, does it matter? And that like it just that simple question hit me in a really poignant and powerful way, and it like changed the course of my faith and my spiritual direction. And I see that with this path here, where everyone at the monastery, the people who are supposed to be good, have done all of these, have jumped on, it's politically favorable to turn away from the elder. And through simple acts of love, he finds out that doesn't matter. It's what the elder teaches, it's what's important.
Taggy.
Yes.
Allow us to introduce you to the button to mute your microphone.
What happened? I had to move.
Carried us all through the house and then dumped us in the trash or something, and all kinds of rattling, and I don't even know what happened.
For the last 4 minutes, all we've heard was.
Yeah, it was bordering on gnome-looking unpleasantness.
My bad.
Thank you, Aaron, for generously sharing something intimate and having it end with taggy ruffle noises.
This is the story of our band as well.
So apropos.
I kind of see this section as sort of Zosima's last words and testimony to Alyosha. And it doesn't really matter whether it's an actual vision or just a dream or whatever. But I see it as kind of like, here's why I sent you into the world. Just give an onion, and there's this kingdom here of paradise that is wide open to everybody, and it just needs a few people to start this ripple effect of a tiny gift that opens a doorway for somebody. And this is how we're going to transform the world, and how paradise could be possible tomorrow if we just want it, I have a note here. This is my own personal reading, and this might be going too far, but this particular vision that you see of the elder at the feast of Cana, the wedding of Cana, this is the vision of a joyous kingdom that triumphs over all despair and meanness. that invites all the world to join and seeks even now to make this joy available on earth. And I think this is kind of like his final entrusting of that task, showing how it's possible. It's like almost like this is easier than you think in a way. Just an onion, that's all you need.
I hear the ocean right now.
I'd like to ask a question if anybody knows the answer. This is maybe one of my weird slant questions, but we've been talking about this onion so much. Does anybody know what the word onion meant to a Russian in the mid 1800s? Like, how is an onion something that you can pull somebody out of a lake with? I'm picturing like a spring onion, maybe, or maybe it's a dried onion with the stalk still on it. It's like hanging up in a garage somewhere. I'm trying to visualize this onion, and it's obviously not the onions that we buy in grocery stores.
Yeah.
This is definitely a slant question, but I can actually answer that, I think.
Okay.
Thanks to watching a weird Tarkovsky film. And onions were actually like really a big part of the diet. There's a scene in the movie where a guy just picks an onion from the ground and starts eating it, out of his hand. And I think it's more how onions grow naturally, not like what we find in the stores. There's a little bulb and a long stalk, the green. So I imagine it's more thinking if you're hanging onto the bulb and they're holding the, the green part.
I kind of think of it as more of like a green onion, where it's like hollow inside and it's really weak and kind of stem and insubstantial at the same time. And it's, I think that makes the story even more like, it's like if you look in like recipes and stuff, like green onions are like, you don't actually get the bulb. The bulb is actually the waste in this thing, but it's like the hollow core of the stalk of the onion is what you're after. It's like the onion itself is not the bulb, it's like the stem, and the stem is actually one of the weakest things you can cut through. Like it's really easy to cut through. It's like a garlic stem or something like that. You don't really use the garlic stems too much, but like a chive or something like that would be more apropos in parlance. But this idea of like the onion being something weak, insubstantial, readily available, and more or less inconsequential, I think is better.
And delicious.
And delicious at the same time. It's got a lot of flavor, but structurally it's not anything worth like if you want to pull someone out of hell with an onion, I think the only thing that makes sense is not the bulb itself, like here, grab onto my bulb of an onion. It's more like grab onto this long stem skinny thing of weakness, like and that'll actually pull you out of hell. And I think that's a much more powerful message.
I mean, it's like the vulnerability of it, which is what's happening in this chapter.
Right.
Or the last chapter.
It's not like pull on the half bulb of my onion. Like that's actually quite substantial. It's like
starting to sound dirty, Michael. Does anyone have any other questions for the group? Comments about this week's reading? I think we are done. So thank you, everybody, for another good conversation. I'm trying to remember what next week's reading is. I believe it's just the next book. Book 8, Mitya. This is a little bit longer than the sections we've been reading recently. It's about 80 pages, so make sure you give yourself enough time to finish it up, but we'll see you all next week. Thanks, guys.